to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Barbara Driscoll. She's currently the president of the New Hope Audubon and the co-committee chair for New Hope's Bird Friendly Committee. She is all about promoting bird friendly habitats, pollinator habitats, native species, and she's going to talk to us today about how to make our yard bird friendly. So without further ado, Barbara Driscoll.
Thank you. Thank you. Just want to thank you for inviting me, Pete Schubert, to speak at this conference. I've been working with Pete on creating bird-friendly yards for quite some time. And just a word about New Hope Audubon Society. We're a local Audubon society. There's a state Audubon also. We cover Orange, Durham, and Chatham counties, and we do a lot of things like bird walks, education, and our bird-friendly certification program. And so this applies mainly to our area, but we have been encouraging other Audubon chapters to also potentially do bird-friendly habitat certification. So I got into this because of my interest in biodiversity and increasing the biodiversity in my yard. And these are all photos from my yards. One of my hobbies is photography, so I can entertain myself just by going outside and looking at what is in my yard. And I will say that the biodiversity has increased quite a bit since I've been planting more native plants and removed all the invasive plants from my yard. So this is a headline from a year or so ago, but it's relevant to today. We've lost 3 billion birds since 1970, and based on a lot of our counts and everything. But I think this is also applicable to not just birds, because these are things that we count quite easily. I think it applies to all of our species, and in particular to our insect species. There have been drastic declines. I do butterfly counts, and I think we are seeing locally in the Piedmont area, Harry LeGrand said we're seeing about 25% of the species we saw in the 70s. So that's a 75% loss in at least butterflies. So it's quite critical, and everybody, who is out in the field sees these things. Part of this is that we are growing at a tremendous rate. These are projections. When I started giving this presentation a number of years ago, this seemed like pretty far in the future, and now it's seeming pretty close. And maybe this is an underestimate because this is an old map from projected housing density. And but you can see that most of the area of North Carolina is projected to see some type of growth. And unfortunately, most of what gets put into all of these suburb developments, 80% of it is non-native plants, and a lot of that is turf. And so that's something that we have been fighting, trying to get people to realize the importance of planting native and reducing their turf. So a yard like this actually produces nothing for wildlife. There's nothing here that, for insects, it's all non-native species. And even this yard too, which is quite pretty, also doesn't provide much because none of these species are native. It may provide some nectar for some bees, but other than that, it's not really helping promote biodiversity in our yards. So probably a lot of you have heard of Doug Ptolemy. He's an entomologist who studies in Delaware, and he's written a number of books. And he figured out this connectivity that I think, was pretty obvious, but people just didn't think about it, between native plants and everything that goes up the food chain from native plants, and how critical it is that we use native plants in our yard. And since 90% of the insects that evolved here evolved with our native plants. And so, they're not going to eat a lot of the other plants for that reason. And that's why a lot of people have been planting, I think, non-natives, because they don't want to see their things get eaten. But, you don't really notice, and I'll talk about this a little more, that some of the plants are being eaten, because that's just the normal a cycle. That's how everything evolved. If you are thinking about creating a bird-friendly yard or a bird-friendly area, there's several things to consider: vegetative layers, food, water, shelter, and nesting sites. And I think this is something that people don't think about, but birds live at all different layers of the in our yards. There are birds that specialize on the ground, such as towhees and thrushes, sparrows. There are birds that live in the mid-story and shrubs, such as cardinals, blue jays. A lot of our more common things like wrens. And then there's canopy birds also, like palm warblers and nuthatches. So birds don't live at one layer. So when you're thinking about creating a bird-friendly yard, you need to think about having these different layers in your yard in order to have the highest biodiversity in your yard. So there's 4 food groups. And one of the critical things that Doug Ptolemy did a lot of work on was um, how many insects do baby birds need to feed their chicks? So chicks, baby birds, 98% of all of our bird chicks are only fed insects. They don't get fed seeds, they don't get fed suet. The things that we feed adult birds are not things that they can feed their chicks. They can normally only feed them insects. And he did a lot of research, and as a professor, he has a lot of access to free labor, such as graduate students. But he counted how many caterpillars it takes for one chickadee to raise a brood. Now, this number here on this slide is a little inaccurate because he's revised this. It's more like 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. A chickadee weighs about 2 ounces, and normally they will have 4 chicks in a brood, and they will only have one brood a year unless they fail, and then they may have another. So you're looking at 6 to 9,000 caterpillars and then other insects beyond that to feed these chickadees. And why caterpillars? Caterpillars are little packages of protein that are in squishy little um, um, containers that easily go down a chick's throat and provide a lot of protein for the chicks so they can grow. Um, and one of the things about native plants that he's done more research on is that, not all native plants are equal. Plants are very good at adapting, as we all know, to protecting themselves. And the older plants, like ferns, have really figured out how not to be eaten. Um, so out of 90% of our plants, 90% of our caterpillars are created only on 14% of our native plant species, and we call these keystone plants. So they're the ones that actually create all the critical food for that supports the web of life going up from um, um, birds on up to higher animals. And so, just so you know, on our website at newhopeaudubon.org, we have a downloadable spreadsheet for the Piedmont, and we've included the number of caterpillars for the keystone plants in our plant list. We have a plant list that's for the Piedmont and includes trees, shrubs, perennials, vines, grasses, and we have put in how many caterpillars are supported by each of the plants if you want to look at that. And also there's a website, National Wildlife Federation, that has the information, but we've done it for you if you live in our area, if you want to get that. So the top 10 plants, oak. If you're going to plant one tree and you have the space for it, an oak is the best um, tree to plant because it provides for up to 488 different species of Lepidoptera. So we have about 400 species of butterflies and around 3,000 species of moths. Oaks are all around the best that provide food for our birds and other wildlife. Black cherry, birch, you can see the list here. It's also on our website. Oak, again, not only does it provide food via caterpillars, but it also provides acorns and nuts, which are great for birds. And this is the native cherry. It's a black cherry. These berries, I rarely see these berries because they don't last long once they get ripe. The birds will eat them immediately, but it also is the host for over 362 species of Lepidoptera or caterpillars, including tiger swallowtails. So migration, we just finished the fall migration. This is the most dangerous time of year for birds. They are the ones that are leaving here and are flying south. They will lose up to 35% or a third of their body weight in transit. And every time they stop, they need to refuel, which means that they need to have places to stop and eat bugs along the way. So, that's why your yard is important. That's why any area is important because birds don't have a map that says, well, here's a national park, go stop here. They're going to stop along the flyway that they're on. And sometimes they may have to stop because of weather. So, everywhere along that stop should be places where they can find food. And we see them in our yard coming through in migration in particular, stopping and eating quite a bit and drinking water. So here's the migratory routes going north to south. And in the spring, they'll come back and they may do a different route. They may come up this way in the spring, or actually they're trying to get on their breeding grounds pretty early, so they'll come the most direct route across the Gulf. But they have to have body weight to do that. And one of the things that's really critical about our native species of many of our plants is that they produce berries and nuts just at the right time. Spice bush. The reason this is better than any kind of non-native is because these berries are all high in fat, whereas the non-natives, such as privet, that people say, oh, they'll eat the berries. Well, they'll eat the mahonia berries, they'll eat the privet berries, and of course that causes problems because those spread. But these berries actually have a lot of high fat content, which helps the birds beef up for their migration. And it also has these cool spice bush caterpillars and spice bush butterflies. Dogwood is another one. You'll always see thrushes eating dogwood berries. Beautyberry. I love this plant. I have it all over my yard, and because the birds are spreading it all over my yard, so it's a great plant, and I give it out to a lot of people every year. But they eat all of these berries. Pokeweed is another one. That has great berries on it. Chokeberry, inkberry, and a lot of these plants really are. I would mark them as deer resistant in most areas because the deer aren't eating them. Winterberry is one where it holds its berries longer than most others, and the local populations like mockingbirds and cardinals will eat these berries a little bit later in the season. The other thing that birds need are seeds and nuts for food. If you have seen any of Doug Ptolemy's recent webinars, he's just written a book about oaks and how, you know, by themselves, blue jays pretty much repopulated all the oaks after the ice age. They spread oaks via carrying the nuts and burying them in different places, sort of like squirrels do, and then forgot about it. And our nuthatches, the brown-headed nuthatch, it has an affinity to pines and pine seeds. And I see them come and get seeds off our feeder and then go stick them under the bark of a pine tree. They try and hoard stuff and then they forget they've done it too. Some of our perennials that are great for seeds are coneflowers and rudbeckia. We also want people to plant things that have nectar. If you're interested in hummingbirds, cardinal flowers are great. I see them at the botanical garden. In my yard, there are birds that are just guarding these areas where their cardinal flowers are planted. Coral honeysuckle, trumpet vine, crossvine, all great nectaring plants. The other thing you should think about in creating a bird-friendly habitat is water. Um, I mentioned that in migration, a lot of birds show up in our yard. It's specifically because in a lot of ways they can hear the water. We have a small pond feature that has a little fall just like this. They will come down and drink the water out of our pond, and they will look for food around there. So this is a great if you want to see birds, and it needs to be shallow. and anything will do. You can do this shallow a container is great for birds. Keep it 1 inch or less, and they will bathe in it and they'll drink water out of it. Just make sure you keep it clean when it's a small container like this. Leaf litter, I think this has been one of the things that's been underlooked. Doug Ptolemy was talking about in his presentation how critical this is. And when you think about our deciduous forest, you realize that litter is a bad term, and I need to change the slide because it's really not litter. This leaves produce nutrients for trees as they're growing, and then in the fall when trees go dormant and they drop their leaves, then these also provide nutrients for the trees, but they also provide overwintering spots for 94% of our insects overwinter in the leaves, including fireflies and most of our caterpillars and moths. So it improves, it provides nutrients for the plants and trees. It also reduces water runoff. So we have New Hope Audubon has initiated this year a Leave Your Leaves campaign, trying to get people to stop blowing the leaves off their property, having the city pick them up and cart them away. And then people get mulch. So there's just a lot of different reasons to leave your leaves. And if you're interested, you can go to the website leaveyourleaves.org. We're doing this with Keep Durham Beautiful. If you live in our area, you can get one of these lovely yard signs for your yard. And we have materials to share if people are interested in that. Cavity nesters, in general, they have their numbers have declined by 20% or more. I think since we've been putting out bluebird boxes, their numbers have actually increased quite a bit. But some of the nuthatches, we have special boxes for them. New Hope sells boxes to our local area. Shrink the lawn. Somebody mentioned turf. We have around an estimate of 400 million acres of turf in the United States. That's probably an underestimate. If we cut the turf, all that turf by 200 million acres, we'd have so much more parkland and so much more productive areas if we planted those in native and reduced it. Just think of all the fossil fuel that would be reduced, the pollution, chemicals, and these are basically food deserts. Um, they don't produce for our wildlife what we need for them to produce. So this is somewhat speaking to the choir, but this is an important part of our program, talking to people about invasive plants. And I will say that I'm going to talk about our certification program in just a minute, but um, most of the people who aren't certified, or a large majority, are because they have too many invasive plants in their yards. Some additional things to consider: stop window collisions. Over 1 billion birds a year die in window collisions. And this is a lot of this is low-lying buildings and houses. We tend to see the big events like Philadelphia this year. 1,500 birds were killed overnight during migration. And then they started a lights out program. Raleigh has started a lights out program. But if you're at home now, you're probably hearing of birds hitting your window. So you need to address that, because most of those mortalities, they may fly off, but they may die later. And of course, cats. This is a hard topic to speak about with people, but because nobody's little Missy ever has eaten anything that they shouldn't. But, we recommend people who have to have their cats outdoors maybe create something like a catio, which is sort of fun. Portland Audubon has a catio tour every year of people who have built these contraptions. And a friend of ours who actually inherited a cat from her neighbor built one, and she said the cat just loves it, and she doesn't have to worry about the cat impacting her wildlife. So the new garden aesthetic, 70% minimum native plants. You're going to hear more birds. You're going to see more insects. You're going to hear frogs. It's something that we are working towards. Encouraging people that chaos and messiness. That's what nature is. I think people have gotten so used to, I don't want anything. I want a sterile look in my yard. Well, sterile is sterile. I mean, that's basically what you're getting. You're not going to get fireflies. You're not going to get butterflies. You're not going to get bees. You're not going to get birds or frogs. So I mentioned our bird friendly certification program. We've started this in 2015. I was working on numbers last night. We have um, evaluated more than 1,000 acres, close to 300 different properties. And what we look for is a combination of native plants, keeping in mind that you have vegetative layers because the vegetative layers are important. These other wildlife habitat options, such as water, functioning bird boxes, etc., those are critical. And we certify people at different levels: silver, gold, and platinum. And as I mentioned, nobody who has more than 20% invasive plants can be certified. And so probably about 50-70%, 50 to 60% of the people who don't get certified are not certified because they have too many invasive plants. So we educate them about the invasive plants and how to remove those on their property. And so the silver level is the lowest level. We have more people qualify at silver. We sort of have this in between. We have a lot of people at platinum and a lot of people at silver. We so we really need to raise the bar. This landscape is not producing anything for our wildlife, and it could be. It could be quite easily. And that's the end of my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay.
Um, so I had a question that came up while I was pondering your presentation. You provided plenty of evidence that native fauna are reliant upon native plants. We know that, that's documented, well documented. Is there anyone looking at like evidence to the contrary or the inverse that non-native plants are providing food to non-native fauna? I'm wondering if, but the angle would be that, we know why we should promote native plants because of these ecological relationships built over time. But is there a reason to a stronger reason to not plant invasives or non-natives because they might be feeding non-native fauna?
I don't know that anybody is studying that. We definitely have studied whether those non-native plants are producing anything for our native caterpillars. Doug has done some work on that. The majority of non-native plants like crepe myrtles and some of these others produce zero or maybe one or two species will have crossed over and will have used them as far as Lepidoptera. But in response to your question, no. It seems like whenever we get an invasive species like the emerald ash borer or something else, they tend to eat all our native plants
Right.
um, because there are just no controls there to keep them in check. So I mean, I think people will say, "Oh, I love my crepe myrtle." I'll say, "Well, it's producing nothing for wildlife." And when I started working on this, I started thinking about how my yard is, as a gardener, you want your yard to be pretty, but I started thinking about, is my yard productive? And I think that's the difference. I have a pretty yard and I have a lot of flowers and all the neighbors come over and look at my flowers and their kids come and look at the bees and the butterflies. My yard is productive. It's not just pretty, it's productive too. So it's helping insects and it's helping wildlife. And that's what one of the points we try and get across. And I think a lot of people who have been home now for the pandemic um, are realizing this. And so we've had quite an uptick this year in the number of people who are buying native and planting native and trying to do something better in their yard, as well as the invasive plant control. And I think that's one of the areas where we have a list of landscapers and designers on our website, as well as nurseries that we work with to try and promote that they don't carry invasive plants. We won't carry them on our website if they have certain percentage of invasive plants. And we try and encourage all of the garden retailers to not carry any invasive plants. So we've recently switched to a highly recommended list and a qualified recommended list based on our visits to some of the retail stores that sell native plants and other plants. And then we also have a lot of landscapers who get jobs or work from us because we're telling people, well, you've got to remove all of these invasives from your yard, or you're just not going to have the biodiversity that you want and the bird-friendly yard that you want. And I think that's where your organization is very helpful. And a couple of years ago, working with Johnny Randall, we held a workshop at the Botanical Gardens as part of your conference for a number of just citizens. We have a lot of citizens who really want to remove invasive plants and just don't necessarily know how to go about it. So I think those are some areas that where we can partner on um, working with the local organizations to help them and their members do a better job of removing invasive.
Excellent. I had one other specific question because this is something that I ran across in the town of Brevard where I live. So there was some recent landscaping done by the city. There's a native plant garden installed, and like literally side by side was planted native Calicarpa and the non-native Calicarpa. And I was just wondering, how common do you see that often? And is there the potential that nurseries are
Yes.
missing a QA/QC and just not realizing there are more than one species, or there is a non-native? It was interesting to me to see that.
So we see that actually on a lot of yard visits that people say, "Oh, I planted beautyberry, and the nursery told me this was beautyberry," and we'll say, "Yes, it was. It is. It's a Japanese beautyberry." Um, and it does, the birds are going to eat it, and it's going to spread, and it's going to become more invasive. But we tell when we visit all of the nurseries, we also tell them that what's one reason why we have a, a plant sheet, our native plant sheet that we have that you can download, and you can also put it on your phone so that we tell people when you go to the nursery, you need to ask for the genus and species to make sure that you're not getting some Chinese variant of this, which a lot of the plants have a Chinese, you say elm. Oh, I'll give you a Chinese elm, or something like that. So, I mean, we recommend at the retailers, and we try and work with them. And it would be good if we could do this across the state, but we just don't have the bandwidth for that. But yeah, to eliminate, there's no reason for anybody to be growing Japanese beautyberry. The American beautyberry is a lovely plant, and it's the one that should be here and is evolved with all of our insects. I guess to answer your question, but we do see that. Um, and we see nurseries still selling Mahonia in privet and saying those are good for wildlife, and they're just not. That's not what we should be feeding our wildlife.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Barbara, thanks so much. That was a very informative presentation. I do know a lot about native plants and landscaping. I try to enact a lot of that in my yard, but I always learn something new when I listen to content like this. So we really appreciate you coming and presenting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, folks. It looks like we are going to be going into break.